Hello, everyone, and welcome to Windows in Time. Medford celebrates Oregon's 1934 Diamond Jubilee, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Briston Strong, the Programs Coordinator. This program is being recorded, and there will be time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera to ensure quality recording until that time. Before we start with our presenter, I am going to read our land acknowledgement. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Takelma, and Lakawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land.
I wanted to introduce today's speaker, who's someone I know fairly well. He's a former educator, retired RCC administrator, history major. He did one of those interesting things. He got his master's in history, and then he went to community college to get his AS in electronics so that he could get a job in a community college, and it worked. So that was his long career there. His major or longtime interest is in railroad history, and he's written on the Southern Pacific Railroad extensively. But when he got started at the Southern Oregon Historical Society, he got interested in local and regional history and has given a number of talks for Windows in Time on those topics. And this is one of those today, an event that happened in 1934, the height of the Depression, a time when Southern Oregon was in political turmoil, and it all got pulled together in the Diamond Jubilee. Larry Mullaly.
Thank you. This is a fairly together presentation, meaning that I'm not entirely sure of its length, but it will not exceed our time. So I wanted to say something about the research process that goes into this. And it very much relates to what happens here in Windows in Time, because things are shared sideways. Windows in Time is now in about its 13th year, 12 presentations a year. None of them have ever been given twice, and just about all of them are original research, meaning that topics that get exposed there then get picked up by other listeners and become resources for the next topics. So there's a couple of different areas that contributed to this, all kind of indirectly. One was Kevin Keating, who's spoken here several times. And a couple of years ago, on the anniversary of the Chamber of Commerce, he was asked to write a brief history, which he did, and which I knew was available, and I knew Kevin Keating. Another was Jeff Lalande, and the very first talk he ever gave of this group, the very first talk of Windows in Time, was given in the room right across the hall here by Jeff Lalande. But a year and a half ago, he produced a classic documentary on Jackson County called the Jackson County Uprising, which describes the troubles in Jackson County in the early 30s and is a tremendous resource if you're dealing with that. And that inspired, you'll see a portion of this talk. SOHS always inspires research because it has so much to offer. And for putting this together, it made available to me videos of the Diamond Jubilee, which it has Copco films. It has still photos, many of which you'll see. And it also has a vertical file. The vertical file contains things like this pamphlet on the display here. And all these things together make possible what seems like a very straightforward talk. The Oregon, Medford celebrates the Oregon Diamond Jubilee of 1934. But I want to say one other little thing. I acknowledge at the bottom that this is using artificial intelligence. Well, it's not using it too much, except there was a need. The need is this. If you have a fairly dense PowerPoint presentation like this does with 80 pictures or so, you reach corners where you do not have the picture. And I discovered that the easiest thing to do is, if you subscribe to one of these, the right one, so this is a graphics artificial intelligence, is you ask for a pen and ink drawing, and you describe it very carefully. And then you press the go button, and in about 30 seconds, it gives you a nice pen and ink drawing, and you'll see them right through the show. And you look at it and say, oh, they're not wearing leather shoes. I better tell it the year. And the women are all the same age, and I can't have that. And the men, nobody has hats, or everybody has hats. I have to correct that. So you do a lot of restating this statement. So by the time you're done, you feel I put a lot of work into this picture. And it keeps giving you new iterations of it. And then that's what you see. But it works. And by doing them in pen and ink, I was trying to make sure that you didn't think I was using something that came out of a newspaper. Medford celebrates Oregon's 1934 Diamond Jubilee. On a street overhung with red, white, blue, and gold bunting, sounds of cracking bullwhips and clattering hooves mingled with the whine of fiddles and applause in what was the largest celebration ever held in Medford up to that time. As a display of social unity in a time of bitter division, it spoke volumes about the people's better angels, and it speaks to us today. Sitting astride the West Coast primary north-south highway, Medford, Oregon in 1932 was described by its boosters as a go-ahead city whose social scene of luncheons and parties were followed almost as eagerly in the newspapers as sports and world events. At the center of a city of over 20 churches and a dozen fraternal lodges sat the Medford Chamber of Commerce, headquartered in what had been the agricultural exhibit building of the region on Main Street, adjacent to the railroad tracks. And his membership was composed of store owners, merchants, shippers, and agriculturalists, who collectively represented one of the most active volunteer groups in the state. So large that its meetings took place at the Medford Hotel in its grand ballroom. And all its adherents spoke the same talk. They represented a modern Western metropolis that was held an important position in world commerce. That's how they said it. But the can-do spirit of the meetings in Medford could not keep the real world from crashing in. The Great Depression had hit Southern Oregon hard. Unemployment was high, and many businesses had failed. Public agencies were hard-pressed to maintain services, and citizens were struggling. Above all, those scattered in the Jackson County's backcountry, many of whom blamed downtown, a downtown Medford gang, as they called it, that included the sheriff, the courts, and the leadership for their suffering. In rural Jackson County, the spirit of radical populism ran deep. And in the fall of 1932, all eyes were on the upcoming November elections, in which the common people had the chance to finally purge those who conspired against them. And at this was improbable of all moments, the Medford Chamber of Commerce spun out what seemed like a fantasy from a parallel universe. What Medford, and by extension, all of Jackson County needed, they announced, was a huge celebration, a festivity that would take place in 2 years' time, honoring Oregon's Diamond Jubilee of statehood, and one that would display Jackson County in all its glory to the world. It would show the region as the crown jewel of Oregon, a wonderland of orchards, parks, woodlands, and scenic beauties. It was not surprising then that Alice Applegate Sargent, the highly respected matriarch of Jacksonville, dismissed the entire idea as absurd. The grand old pioneers, were they here today, she wrote to the Medford Mail Tribune, would never stage a jubilee when the people were needing bread. But in the boisterous, go-ahead environment of the chamber, the grand notion of the Jubilee was eagerly endorsed. On November 8th, 1932, one day after the chamber's announcement went public, the national presidential election took place, and local as well. And a record number of people in Jackson County, particularly in the country districts, took part. It proved to be the most contentious election ever to take place in Southern Oregon, and tied society into knots for months. When the smoke had finally cleared, 10,000 ballots had been stolen from a vault in the courthouse and destroyed to prevent a recount. Press reports told of an armed militia walking Main Street. A Medford police constable had been murdered by a leading opposition figure. And 2,000 protesters gathered on the steps of the courthouse, protesting in behalf of the assailant. Medford was a disgraced city, and its name was splashed on the front pages of newspapers throughout the country. Within weeks of the election, however, at the Chamber of Commerce, attractive invitations were being mailed to chambers of commerce, magazines, newspapers, and radio stations from British Columbia to Southern California, as well as governors of all the Western states, inviting them to send delegations to the celebration of what was described as 75 years of state progress in the development of Southern Oregon. Left unsaid was the fact that the Medford event had no official sanction and that the city had not even existed when the state was created. But all this was made right 2 months later, when a joint resolution of the Oregon House and Senate was procured, designating, quote, Medford and Jacksonville. They got the historic link by pairing it with Jacksonville, which had a very modest part in the actual event, together as the official site of the anniversary ceremony, adding, quote, these communities have already started plans and issued thousands of invitations to the affair. All was made right. Nothing more was heard of the event for several months. The Chamber's dozen and very busy standing committees occupied themselves with other projects. And one of these paid important dividends as this Jubilee advanced. For several years, the chamber had been quietly working to bridge the divide between the city and rural voters. It had changed its name from the Medford Chamber of Commerce to the Jackson County Chamber of Commerce, which it still has today. And it had brought in representatives from throughout the county to serve on its board and sponsored special interest groups of small fruit growers, dairymen, poultrymen, and farmers, using its central location for a meeting place. That summer, a very successful farmers' picnic was hosted by the chamber at Medford Central Park, who arranged that restaurants throughout the city would set up booths to serve free meals to more than 2,000 members of the farming community who had received free dinner tickets. The event, featuring live music, entertainment, began in typical Medford Chamber fashion with a parade up Main Street, in which 200 members dressed in white aprons and carrying cooking utensils marched up the street to the park to serve the meal. Not everything went like clockwork, however. 8 months passed between the announcement of the event and the chamber's success in finally finding a person to serve as the event chairman. For this, they selected a smooth-talking Standard Oil regional manager. Unfortunately, he resigned 2 months after taking the position and moved to California. And during the 2 months he had been in charge, virtually nothing had been done. Now desperate to jumpstart the project, the chamber turned to a longtime chamber member, Jerry Jerome. Jerry was a sporting enthusiast and a Shriner activist, best known for his hijinks as the Great Eruption, which was the title of the president of a little group called the Craters, whose principal purpose seemed to be to conduct guerrilla warfare activities against the rival city of Grants Pass. And so it was that at the dedication of the imposing Caveman Bridge in Grants Pass in 1929, the Criterions scored their greatest success. After much careful presentation, they arrived at the dedication ceremony in mustaches and military uniforms, escorting a high-ranking Mexican general who had come to honor the occasion. And people believe this. Playing the role of the general, Jerome gave a brief speech in Spanish, a language which he did not speak. And the entourage departed to applause without anyone, at least for the moment, being the wiser. Jerome, over the years, had worked with many chamber members and seemed to be on good terms with almost everyone in town. And he became the spark that finally got the Diamond Jubilee project moving forward. Jerry was open to all ideas. He was a consummate salesman for what he was describing as, quote, the greatest event of its kind in the history of the state. And he moved fast. Within 2 weeks after his appointment, he had gone north to Portland, where he had gathered the endorsement of Oregon Governor Julius Meyer, who lived there. He also obtained the approval of the Portland City Mayor and the Portland Chamber of Commerce. And with these blessings in hand, this is Governor Meyer, he made the rounds of Medford civic and social organizations, reminding them of favors he had done for them personally in the past, and assuring them that each would have a vital role to play in the great event. 2 weeks after returning from Portland, he assembled a general committee of 18 chairpersons whom he had selected and appointed, sharing with them a cornucopia of ideas that he had gathered in a short time. The event would feature a massive aerial circus at the Medford airport. It would have dog races with pari-mutuel betting at the fairgrounds, a display of Oregon-made and grown products and industrial exhibitions at the Armory, a rabbit show someplace, home shows throughout the city, and fancy receptions in the hotels for visiting dignitaries. But Jerome's glistening, multi-faceted vision, symbolized by the new logo of the event, lacked one essential thing. It was without the lift of a driving dream. It had no focus. Among those listening that day was a tall, urbane gentleman from Ashland, Dr. Irving Vining, a well-known figure who had deep roots in Southern Oregon, who in earlier years had been the co-author of the Boy Scouts of America handbook, and had been long-time president of the Oregon Chamber of Commerce through the 1920s. He was also a remarkable speaker and had given numerous talks to businessmen, political groups, educators, and clubs on motivational subjects throughout the country. His degree, in fact, was in psychology, though he had once taught at Southern Oregon Normal School literature, and as we'll see, he had taught drama. Now in semi-retirement, Jerome had given Vining the innocuous task of putting together a pioneer exhibit for the storefronts. Finding the professor proved to be the needed complement to Jerry Jerome, the Great Eruption. At a chamber planning meeting held at Ashland's Southern Oregon Normal School on December 20th of that year, Vining confronted the need for a better focus head on. The Diamond Jubilee, he argued, should celebrate the continuum of a region and its peoples. It should elevate the soul with music, dance, and spectacle, and a great pageant that would include an epic stage production and a history-themed parade that would be different from anything ever attempted, end quote. Stirred by Vining's eloquence, Chamber of Commerce members gladly endorsed the idea and agreed to hire the young Angus Bomer, the normal school's promising drama professor, later famous for founding the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. A year later, he would be contracted to write and direct the epic pageant, the drama. Vining would have editorial control over both the pageant and the parade, and the chamber, with its tradition of community service, would do the rest. Vining and Bomer had other connections. Both were literature teachers at the same institution, or the successor institution. And in the late 1890s, Southern Oregon Normal School, a teacher's college with Vining there, had staged The Merchant of Venice. And when they had done that, the professor, the instructor, Vining, had played the role of Shylock. Later that same year that this is taking place that I'm describing, Boehmer staged The Merchant of Venice. And he played the role of Shylock. Let's get back. Vining and Boehmer were meeting with the Jubilee's board of directors on a weekly basis now to integrate the pageant with the numerous other aspects of the events. Matters moved rapidly. Within weeks, pageant scripts had been approved along with parade plans to rely on horse-drawn orchard wagons to display historical tableaus with live characters. By February, and now there are only 4 months remaining before the event was to take place, Chamber of Commerce committees were frantically at work, organizing ticket sales, musical entertainment, housing accommodations, traffic flow, and other aspects of the gathering. A huge amount of background support was provided by the Chamber's professional manager and a group of trained secretaries, competent secretaries. The Jubilee budget was a particular challenge, and events evolved. Dog racing soon gave way to a more lucrative arrangement with the professional rodeo and another one with the carnival company. Exhibit space it was decided to rent exhibit space for commercial booths in the Medford natatorium and along the parade route. It was also decided to maximize the fairground's earnings. Contracts were let for carnival rides and a dance band, downtown banners, and costumes for pageant actors. These were expenses, these weren't earnings. The expenses had to absorb these things. And these are the actors, some of the actors that took part in the great pageant. But most things were done, as was typical of Medford at the time, on a volunteer basis. Boy Scouts hung posters and agreed to serve as ushers at the fairgrounds. The county's Public Works Department obtained federal make-work money to build bleachers for the pageant and benches along the parade route. The Lions Club raided a parking lot on Riverside Avenue. Families made rooms available for out-of-town guests, and wealthier members of the community were tapped for loans with the expectation, but not the guarantee, of having these repaid from event profits. The community at large also rose to the occasion. Schools, scout groups, clubs, and fraternal organizations sponsored dozens of smaller events, including a bridal gown show, an educational symposium, old-time dances, barbecues, and of course, the rabbit show. The Medford Mail Tribune agreed to publish the names of homeowners who took part in a cleanup paint-up program, who painted their houses, that is, and it's intended to make neighborhoods more presentable. When rain muddied the fairground area during rehearsal time, local sawmills provided truckloads of sawdust to sop up the moisture. Stores offered window space to display pioneer artifacts. A trucking firm agreed to show event banners on 65 of its long-haul trucks. And the Greyhound Bus Company promised to display window cards in all its buses. Standard Oil Company of California purchased loudspeaker equipment for the entire program free of charge. Much of the preparatory work was done by person-to-person contact, with downtown chamber members traveling all around the countryside, visiting farmers, walking through old barns, looking for pieces of equipment that could be used in the parade, particularly wagons. As the collection of vehicles grew, they were brought into town, but along with them came the need for men, women, and children to ride them, and the need for animals to pull them. 200 horses and mules and several oxen were eventually obtained for the event. 24 Native Americans were also recruited from the Warm Springs Reservation to ride horseback. Elderly pioneers were encouraged to take part in the parade, including 75-year-old Alice Hanley. She's a little younger in this picture here, who agreed to ride shotgun atop a stagecoach. Calls for more help frequently appeared in the Medford papers. As the event grew in size, it seemed that everyone wanted to get in on the act. And volunteers at event headquarters in the Sparta building busily fielded requests from those seeking to help. To accommodate entries unsuited for the Pioneer Parade, a separate agricultural and industrial parade was added for the following day. It soon included 10 marching bands, drill teams, automobiles, an equestrian club from Wairika, the Grants Pass Cavemen, I guess they'd made their peace, and floats from the 8 Jackson County Granges. By late May, Medford took on the appearance of a busy Hollywood back lot. Downtown traffic was regularly interrupted by strings of wagons being pulled to assembly points. The Medford Mail Tribune reported, quote, "We are knee-deep in covered wagons, and in the city's neighborhoods there were, quote, more floats than ivory soap." From the very beginning, Vining and a small executive committee had kept tight thematic and programmatic control over the events. Working closely with them was the Chamber of Commerce member, Ernest Rustell, a brilliant young writer on leave from his job as Chief Information Ranger at Crater Lake National Park. And it was Rustell who provided an endless stream of well-written press releases, often daily. Rustell worked closely with Vining and the Jubilee's executive committee to ensure that messaging was on target. The Native American population was treated as primordial pioneers, and from them, the title of the epic pageant was taken. Or Ungone, Shoshone, or Land of Plenty. And interestingly enough, very similar to the name of our state. Ernest Rustell became the voice of the event, and newspapers as far east as Chicago carried his stories. At the time of the Jubilee, the head of a major Midwestern newspaper described Medford as, quote, the most publicized city in America. At 8 a.m. on Sunday, June 3rd, 1934, the day dawned like any other day and warmed slowly. But in Medford, a scattering of events in different places had already begun, and with it, the Jubilee. A tennis tournament got underway at Medford Junior High School. An hour later, fly fishing, golf, and trap shooting contests commenced. At 11 o'clock, services, pastors throughout the city preached on, quote, pioneer motherhood, one of Vining's special themes. At 2 p.m., 4,000 people had already filled the county fairground stands 1 mile south of Main Street to hear U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace speak on the future of agriculture. The prosperity of tomorrow, he declared, is dependent upon the new pioneer, whose accomplishments may be as significant as those of the pioneers who first came to Oregon country 75 years ago. I'd like to believe he composed that entirely on his own, but it doesn't sound like it. In the fairgrounds that evening, a large crowd gathered to hear Dr. J.D. Ferguson, considered to be one of the finest preachers in the state, give thanks to Oregon's, quote, uncrowned queens, that is, the mothers, accompanied by a 150-voiced choir. Everyone that day and throughout the week was on script. But nowhere was the lyrical hand of Irving Vining so evident as in the official program distributed that day and throughout the week by the thousands. His first page read, "Lest we forget, this is indeed a time for gratitude and love as we portray the history of our land in the making, we relive those historic deeds of the men and women who carved the foundation of our great Commonwealth." The following day, Monday morning, the Jubilee Carnival commenced. The Indian village opened, and the doors of the manufacturing and mining exhibits were open. In the evening, at the fairgrounds, a children's pageant and the coronation of the 76-year-old Ann Whittaker, daughter of the first governor of Oregon, took place. And Irving Vining read a tribute from the nation's first lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, followed by his own stirring address, and Vining crowned the Queen, which we do not see here. We're a slide ahead. Each day brought added attractions. On Tuesday, the Medford Garden Club exhibit got underway. The Cowan Rodeo, featuring, quote, the best cowboy talent in the country, had the first of 6 sold-out performances at the fairgrounds. And in Ashland, there were children's games, swimming, and archery expositions, and an educational symposium that had been promised. Caravans of cars from, quote, all points of the Pacific coast arrived, and trains disgorged throngs of visitors each day. A squadron of 17 aircraft eventually flew in from San Francisco. On Thursday morning, June 7th, under speckled skies, the long-awaited Pioneer Parade got underway before an estimated crowd of 25,000 spectators, at a time when the population of Medford was 11,000. The great cortege of wagons and horses had formed up at dawn at the fairgrounds and was unlike anything Medford had ever seen. 96 entries, including nearly 30 historical tableaus on wagons, resplendent in white canvas and natural greenery, were joined by hundreds of costume reenactors on foot. There were the great wagons, pioneer men and women on horseback, and floats portraying historic personalities, events, and aspects of territorial days, the indigenous peoples. Churches, homes, circuit riders, and the first newspapers and photographers. There was a stately solemnity to the procession. Its only music was that of the drumbeat or the fiddle, until the very last entry, when in its color and pizzazz, the Medford High School band brought the procession to a close. The following day, the Industrial and Agricultural Parade took place, featuring the Grants Pass cavemen, men and women. 10 marching bands float from 8 Southern Oregon granges, motor vehicles, and equestrian units. But all was prelude to Owen Gone, Oyer Ungone. Performed before sellout crowds in the fairground, where each evening an enormous stage set 150 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 40 feet high was rolled into place. Taking their place in the bleachers, attendees found themselves immersed in a spectacle of vast proportion. The performance traced the first encounters of Native Americans and American explorers. It told the story of Sacagawea conducting the Lewis and Clark expedition. Every element was carefully rehearsed in the daylight, but now it was being reenacted at night under the spots. And as the story went forward, it was accompanied by a 50-person orchestra, hundreds of actors, dancers. It was accompanied by an orchestra of 50 members, hundreds of actors, dancers, working through 5 major sets. Forests of trees were moved into place, and then wagon trains with horses and gunfire. An entire frontier town was erected in the course of a single musical number. The finale, the mountain and backdrop split apart, revealing the entire cast united past and present generations that they had depicted. An assembly that included 2 choirs, the Native Americans who had participated in that day's parade, dancers, Boy and Girl Scouts, units of the National Guard and civilian conservation corps, arrayed before shimmering silver towers. And the music swelled triumphantly as a young woman representing liberty ascended into view, holding an American flag that fluttered in the wind. And the cast and the audience joined in singing the state anthem, Oregon, My Oregon. It was an unforgettable, transcendent moment. The Diamond Jubilee of 1934, held at the time as, quote, the greatest birthday party in the history of the state, was a one-of-a-kind outpouring of collective effort never again repeated. 56,000 visitors were said to have attended the week-long event. In the midst of the Great Depression, a society that a year earlier had been fractured by political divisions had reaffirmed itself in celebrating its common heritage. A bountiful land and a diverse people who, even in the face of adversity, forever look beyond the horizons to a greater, brighter tomorrow. Thank you.